In the spring of 1945, as the world watched the fall of an empire, a smaller, quieter disappearance took place in the forests of Thuringia. What follows is not a legend of ghosts or spirits, but a reconstruction of a paper trail that leads into a darkness that never truly ended. The air in the Thuringian forest during the final weeks of the war was thick with the scent of pine and wood smoke from distant, retreating convoys. Beneath the canopy, the narrow dirt tracks were churned into deep ruts by the weight of heavy machinery moving under the cover of the frequent, low-hanging fog. Local villagers watched from behind shuttered windows as unmarked trucks bypassed the main routes, heading toward the secondary salt works known as Kaiserode II. It was a site far less prestigious than the Grand Merkers mine, a place of damp shafts and unstable ceilings that most miners avoided. In a small, windowless office in Berlin, a clerk's hand trembled as he applied the final stamps to a manifest labeled Item Group 77. The ink was still wet when the crates were loaded onto a specialized rail car, their contents described only as archival materials from the state library. There were no armed guards in ceremonial dress, only a handful of tired men in gray overcoats who spoke in low, urgent tones. They knew the capital was crumbling, and these zinc-lined boxes represented a legacy that someone, somewhere, deemed more important than gold. The journey south was a sequence of long pauses in darkened rail yards and frantic detours to avoid Allied air patrols. By the time the shipment reached the outskirts of the salt works, the spring thaw had turned the mountain passes into a slurry of mud and melting slush. The trucks struggled with the incline, their engines straining with a mechanical whine that echoed through the empty valleys. It was a sound of desperation, a final push to hide something before the horizon turned white with the glare of approaching artillery. At the entrance to the secondary shaft, a lone lantern swung from a rusted hook, casting long, distorted shadows against the jagged rock face. The foreman of the mine, a man whose family had worked these seams for generations, stood silently as the first crate was lowered into the darkness. He noted in his personal log that the crates were unusually heavy for paper, their zinc casings cold to the touch and sealed with lead. There was no conversation between the miners and the transport team, only the rhythmic clatter of the hoist cables and the heavy breathing of exhausted men. As the crates descended into the lower galleries, the temperature dropped, and the air grew heavy with the sharp metallic tang of salt. The lower levels of Kaiserode II were a labyrinth of narrow tunnels, many of which had been poorly braced during the rush of wartime production. The men worked by the dim light of carbide lamps, their flickers revealing the white crust of salt crystals blooming like frost on the timber supports. Every creak of the mountain above seemed magnified in the oppressive silence of the deep earth. By the third day of the operation, the logistics manifest indicates that 42 crates had been moved into the deepest reaches of the mine, far beyond the standard storage zones. A secondary ledger recovered years later from a burned-out staff car mentions a preliminary sealing of the gallery known as Sector C. This was an unusual directive, as the mine was still technically operational and had ample space in its upper levels. The decision to move the items so deep suggests a desire for permanent concealment rather than temporary storage. On the morning of April 4th, a series of muffled thuds vibrated through the forest floor, startling the birds from the trees. It wasn't the sound of Allied bombs, which had a sharper, more crashing resonance, but a heavy, subterranean groan. Smoke began to curl out of the ventilation shafts of the secondary salt works, rising in thin gray ribbons against the overcast sky. When the first scouts from the Third Army arrived hours later, they found the main entrance to Kaiserode II completely obliterated by a massive internal collapse. The military engineers who first inspected the site noted that the demolition was professional and thorough, designed to bring down the primary support pillars of the main haulage way. They focused their efforts on the Merkers mine nearby, where the discovery of billions in gold bullion commanded every available resource. The smaller, collapsed shaft was written off as a munitions dump that had been sabotaged to prevent capture. Nobody questioned why a munitions dump would be located in a saltworks with a history of structural instability. Near the opening of the tunnel, a soldier discovered a dropped bag. Inside, there were some burned maps and one large metal key. The maps showed the inside of the mine, but had notes that were different from the usual mine plans. A specific spot in the lower west part was marked with a red circle and the word "stable" next to it. This was odd, because the supervisor's records had stated that this area often had water problems. As the Allied administration took over the region, the records for Item Group 77 seemed to fragment and disappear into various bureaucracies. The Berlin State Library confirmed that thousands of manuscripts were missing, but their records were too damaged by the bombings to provide a definitive list. The zinc crates were never officially found, and no mention of them appeared in the exhaustive inventories of the Merkers treasure. It was as if the shipment had reached the Thuringian forest and simply ceased to exist in the physical world. The forest eventually reclaimed the area around the old mine entrance, covering the scarred earth with a thick carpet of moss and ferns. For decades, the site remained a quiet, restricted zone, cordoned off by the local authorities due to the ongoing risk of sinkholes. The few hikers who wandered near the perimeter reported a strange stillness in the air, a sense of being watched by the very ground beneath their boots. The mountains held their secret tightly, buried under 1,000,000 tons of salt and the weight of a forgotten mandate. In the mid-1950s, a retired surveyor living in a nearby village began to compile a private archive of the events he witnessed as a young man. He remembered the trucks, the zinc crates, and the specific way the ground shook on that April morning. His notes describe a final truck that arrived after the others, one that was never recorded in the official Allied reports. This vehicle didn't carry crates, but a team of 3 men in civilian clothes who entered the mine just minutes before the charges were detonated. The surveyor's records suggest that these men never came back out, or if they did, they used an exit that didn't appear on any known map. He spent his final years obsessed with the discrepancy, the gap between the number of people who went into the darkness and the number who returned to the light. His sketches of the mine's layout show a hidden ventilation view that bypassed the main collapse, leading into the very heart of Sector C. It was a theory that remained unproven, a series of lines on paper that led into a void. One evening in the late autumn, the surveyor was seen near the old fence line, carrying a lantern and a heavy coil of rope. He was never seen again, and his disappearance was attributed to the treacherous nature of the sinking terrain. The local police found his lantern sitting on a stump near the edge of a fresh sinkhole, its glass cracked but the wick still dry. There were no footprints leading away from the light, only the disturbed soil of a fresh subsidence that reached deep into the earth. The story of the salt mine ledger isn't one of hidden riches, but of a quiet, deliberate erasure of history. The zinc crates may contain nothing more than moldering parchment and ink, or they may hold the very blueprints of a lost era. Whatever lies at the bottom of the secondary shaft is protected by the chemistry of the earth and the finality of the explosives. The ledger remains open, but the pages are blank, waiting for a light that may never return to those lightless corridors. In the early 1990s, following the reunification of Germany, a group of archivists gained access to a cache of Stasi files that had been recovered from a regional headquarters in Erfurt. Among the mundane reports on local dissent was a thick folder labeled Caseroda Secundor, containing surveillance photos from the late 1960s. The images showed Soviet-made drilling rigs positioned over the collapsed salt works, their crews working only during the new moon. Despite the heavy machinery, there was no record of any salt or mineral extraction ever being credited to that site during the Cold War. The Stasi reports noted a series of seismic anomalies that occurred during the drilling, which didn't match the patterns of traditional mining. Deep-bore microphones had picked up rhythmic, metallic sounds, Not the grinding of stone, but the steady, hollow clanging of something heavy being shifted far below. The project was abruptly abandoned in 1972 after a sudden, unexplained loss of pressure in the primary borehole. The final entry in the file was a single typed sentence. The seal remains intact, but the containment is compromised by groundwater. A local history enthusiast, while cataloging the effects of a deceased railroad switchman, found a pocket diary from 1945 that detailed the exact arrival times of the ghost convoy. The diarist noted that the trucks were not marked with military insignia, but with a specific stylized compass rose on the driver's side doors. This symbol was tied to a shadowy logistics department responsible for the final safeguarding of non-monetary assets. The diary ended with a chilling observation. The trucks left the mine area completely empty, yet they rode low on their axles, as if still carrying a massive, invisible weight. The topography of the forest around the mine began to change in the late 1990s, with trees leaning at unnatural angles as the soil beneath them migrated into the voids below. Geologists investigating the sinkholes discovered that the brine levels in the lower western quadrant were rising at an alarming rate. This was the exact area marked stable on the maps found by the Allied private decades earlier. If the zinc crates were indeed stored there, they were now submerged in a corrosive, hypersaturated solution that would preserve or destroy them, depending on the integrity of their seals. In 2005, a declassified document from the British National Archives revealed a frantic 1946 intelligence mission to find a man named Klaus Drachen, the lead engineer of Kaiserode II. Drachen had disappeared from his home 2 days after the mine collapsed, leaving behind a half-eaten meal and a suitcase full of specialized blasting caps. The British believed Drachen hadn't been killed in the collapse, but had been recruited or coerced to ensure the mine stayed sealed from the inside. The search for Drachen spanned 3 continents, but he remained a ghost, his name never appearing on a single post-war manifest. A drone survey conducted by a private research firm in 2018 detected a strange thermal signature emanating from a ventilation grate hidden within a thicket of brambles. While the surrounding ground was near freezing, the air rising from the grate was a constant, humid 14°C. This suggested a massive open cavity still existed beneath the rubble, maintained by some form of natural or artificial airflow. The firm's request to lower a camera into the grate was denied by the state government, citing unstable geological conditions and historical ordnance risks. Among the few artifacts recovered from the surface debris over the years was a rusted pocket watch, its hands frozen at 10:14. When the back of the watch was opened, a small piece of microfilm was found tucked inside the casing, though it was too degraded to reveal a clear image. Modern digital restoration, however, managed to pull a single grainy word from the film: aletheia. In Greek philosophy, the term refers to truth or disclosure, but in the context of a secret wartime transport, its meaning remained frustratingly ambiguous. A retired forest ranger who patrolled the area for 30 years claimed that on certain foggy nights, the sound of a heavy diesel engine can still be heard idling near the old fence line. He never found the source of the noise, nor did he ever find tire tracks in the mud the following morning. He described the sound not as a phantom, but as a mechanical reality, a vibration that he could feel in the soles of his boots. It was as if the mountain itself was breathing through the lungs of a machine that refused to die. In the archives of the Berlin State Library, a researcher found a discarded packing list that had been misfiled for over 70 years. It described the contents of item group 77 not as books, but as the iron registers of the 13th year. There was no record of such registers in any known historical catalog, leading some to believe they were an entirely new classification of state secrets. The weight of each register was listed as 50 kilograms, far too heavy for standard paper records, suggesting they were etched into metal plates. The mystery of the ghost convoy deepened when a cache of letters from a driver's widow was donated to a local museum. Her husband had returned from the war a changed man, refusing to speak of his time in Thuringia, but constantly checking the locks on their doors. He had obsessed over the sound of the lead, a phrase his wife never understood until after his death. She found a small, lead-sealed vial in his desk containing a sample of white crystalline salt that tasted metallic and left a faint blue stain on the skin. During a recent timber harvest, a logging crew unearthed a concrete pylon that had been buried under decades of leaf litter. The pylon was marked with the same stylized compass rose found in the railroad switchman's diary, positioned miles away from the known mine entrance. This suggested that the subterranean complex was far more extensive than the mining charts indicated, possibly connecting to a network of natural caverns. The pylon wasn't a marker, but a survey point for something much larger, a hidden architecture carved into the very foundation of the hills. The persistent silence of the German government regarding the site has only fueled the lost trail of theories surrounding Kaiserode II. Official statements continue to maintain that the site is merely a hazardous industrial ruin with no historical significance. Yet, the presence of modern motion sensors and silent, unmarked patrol vehicles near the sinkholes suggests otherwise. The authorities aren't just protecting people from the mine, they are protecting the mine from the people, ensuring that whatever was buried in 1945 remains in the dark. A recent satellite analysis revealed a slight but measurable electromagnetic hum centered directly over the stable zone. This phenomenon is usually associated with large-scale electrical equipment or high-density metallic deposits. Given that the mine was supposed to be a low-tech saltworks, the presence of such a signature is a technical impossibility. It points to the existence of a facility that was either built in secret during the war or installed in the decades that followed, hidden away from the prying eyes of the surface world. The ledger recovered by the Americans in 1945 remains the only tangible link to the truth, yet even it is incomplete. Several pages were neatly excised with a razor blade, leaving only the ghost of the pen's pressure on the following sheets. Forensic lighting has managed to recover fragments of a final order. In the event of compromise, the silence must be absolute. It was an order that seems to have been carried out with chilling efficiency, extending far beyond the end of the conflict and into the modern era. As the fog rolls into the Thuringian valleys today, it settles over a landscape that holds its breath. The ghost convoy may have reached its destination, but the journey of the items they carried is far from over. Beneath the roots of the pines and the crust of the salt, something remains. Not as a treasure to be found, but as a weight to be carried. The mystery isn't just about what is in the boxes, but about the lengths humanity will go to ensure that some things are never found again. The final push into the depths of the Stabal zone began not with a shovel, but with a series of high-frequency sonar pulses conducted by an independent research collective in 2024. The results revealed a secondary chamber, encased in reinforced concrete and situated nearly 50 meters below the lowest known salt gallery. Unlike the jagged natural formations of the surrounding mine, this structure possessed perfectly geometric lines and a hollow core that suggested a massive, airtight vault. The sonar also detected a strange uniform density within the vault, objects stacked with such precision that they appeared as a single, solid mass to the sensors. In a forgotten annex of the Thuringian Regional Archives, a researcher recently discovered a set of blueprints for a deep atmosphere archive commissioned in early 1944. The design featured a sophisticated climate control system powered by the geothermal heat of the deep earth, intended to maintain a constant humidity for the preservation of delicate materials. The plans were signed by Klaus Draken, the same engineer who vanished during the mine's collapse, proving that the facility was never a mere munitions dump. It was a subterranean fortress built to survive the total destruction of the surface world, designed to keep its contents pristine for centuries. Among the oral histories of the nearby village, a story persists of a quiet man who lived in a secluded cabin on the mountain's ridge well into the 1980s. He was seen only at night, carrying supplies that were delivered by unmarked vehicles, and he spent his days staring at the sinkholes with a pair of military binoculars. After his death, the cabin was found completely empty, the floorboards scrubbed clean, and every scrap of paper burned in the hearth. The only thing left behind was a small, hand-carved wooden compass rose fixed to the doorframe, identical to the one on the ghost convoy. The rise of digital archaeology has allowed for a new interpretation of the Alethea microfilm fragment found in the rusted watch. By layering the grainy image over the 1944 blueprints, researchers realized the word wasn't a philosophical statement, but a specialized password for a pneumatic locking system. This suggests that the vault was not designed to be opened with a key, but through a sequence of air pressure adjustments that only a handful of people understood. The complexity of the mechanism implies that the items inside were not intended to be recovered by a simple salvage team, but by a specific successor. Today, the restricted zone around Kaiserota II remains one of the quietest places in Germany, a dead spot where even GPS signals seem to flicker and fail. The government's continued refusal to allow core sampling in the stable zone has led to a stalemate between historians and the state's safety inspectors. Meanwhile, the sinkholes continue to widen, occasionally swallowing sections of the perimeter fence and dragging them into the lightless void. The mountain is slowly consuming the evidence of its own violation, sealing the iron registers deeper into the bedrock with every passing season. The mystery of the Third Reich's gold eventually faded from the headlines, but the mystery of Item Group 77 remains a haunting constant for those who track the shadows of history. Whether the crates contain the lost thoughts of philosophers, the blueprints for a different future, or simply the cold records of a regime's crimes, their silence is absolute. We are left with only the rhythmic vibration of the earth and the knowledge that some things are hidden so well that they become part of the planet itself. The ledger is closed, the ink is dry, and the trail ends in a place where no light can follow. The forest has a way of breathing over its secrets, the wind through the pines sounding like the faint, distant hiss of a pressured seal. Somewhere beneath the roots and the salt, the ghost convoy has finally found its rest, guarded by the weight of the mountain and the enduring silence of the men who drove it there. The true nature of Item Group 77 remains one of the great silences of the 20th century. While the gold was counted and the leaders were judged, the archives of the deep Thuringian shafts were never officially entered. They remain a grounded reality, a physical presence beneath the soil that reminds us that the most profound mysteries are often the ones we choose not to dig up.